Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Today I've got a slew of terrifying encounters to share with you guys that I'm pretty sure you'll enjoy. Before we get into today's upload, though, a couple links. As you know, I rely on my Patreon, my PayPal, and my merch to help this channel to continue to grow and go. All of those links are in the description below. I also have a second channel for creepypasta, fanfiction, and scary voice acting. Stories that, well, they really don't fit on this channel. Now, if that's anything that you're into, follow that link and give those stories a listen. You may just like what you hear. Now, I've taken enough of your time, everyone. Let's get on with today's upload. Shall we? Today's first encounter. Glengarry, Nova Scotia, in Pictou County. On the first Sunday of March 2012, Robert McLean was driving home from a party in town around 2 in the morning when a deer ran across the road about 50 yards in front of him. It zipped across the road from the left side to the right, down over a steep embankment, moving as fast as anything I'd ever seen, states Robert. He later adds, a second later a big animal chased after the deer, but just before tumbling into the crevice, it stood on its back legs and stared into the headlights, its eyes glowing, and then it was gone. This wasn't the only evidence that was found over that weekend. A local farmer found a cow dead in the field behind his barn, completely eviscerated with huge chunks of meat missing, and large bloody tracks leading off into the woods. It is important to note that Glengarry does not have a large population, mostly scattered homes surrounded by the woods. It is an area where only a few people hunt, as hunters constantly complain about the feeling of being watched. A survey of the area around the possible sighting site turned up a few deer tracks and a reddish smear just off of the road down over the bank. But a sample could not be taken due to the steep nature of the area. Today's second encounter. I was riding my lawnmower to the cemetery to clean up my mother's grave. I have a trail that I ride to avoid the road. I guess it was maybe 7:40 at night or so when I saw something cross the field in front of me. I had my 9-year-old golden retriever with me in the trailer that I tow behind my lawnmower. When she saw something walk across the path adjacent to the field, she started barking for a moment. Then she started whimpering like she was scared. When I saw the animal, I really didn't know what to think. I'd seen TV shows on Bigfoot before, but they were all in other places. When I saw it cross the road, it looked like a really tall man with hair entangled in briars and leaves. When we got to where it crossed the trail, I stopped and turned the lawnmower off to see if I could hear anything. I listened, but I couldn't hear anything but my whining dog in the trailer. The hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I got scared and started the lawnmower and left. I have never seen anything like that before in my life. It was an eerie feeling to be so close to home and see something that I have been taught there is no such thing as. Well, me and my dog are firm believers now. There is something definitely out in the woods, and I'll never think about going into them again unprotected. It really touches on the reality that we are not the only ones out in the wild. Today's third encounter. A friend and I were gathering cattle around dusk about 300 yards from the river. We were pushing the cattle toward the barn, which was about a mile from our location at the time. As we pushed the cattle, we noticed our horses were becoming antsy, and they wanted to go the opposite way of the river. And the cattle were becoming hard to hold together. They were getting antsy as well and nervous. We decided it was a lost cause because for some reason they were frightened. We just thought it was because a storm was on its way, and the cattle gather in the corner before and during the storm. was getting dark, so we headed in angrily and decided to do it in the morning. As we headed home, our horses would not go, and we figured that they were nervous from the oncoming storm. As we impatiently loped them towards the river, my buddy's horse took off on a dead run for the barn. Soon after that, mine followed. As we got to the sandy bank of the Canadian River, we saw a Bigfoot standing there about 100 yards downriver from us. He was squatting on the side of the river, and when we came up, he was startled and jumped to his feet, but didn't run off. The horses stopped with a lot of pulling back on their reins, and because they didn't want to hit the river with a full head of steam. They were very nervous, though, prancing in circles around each other. But we still got a good look. At first, we were very startled at what we had seen, but we didn't run out of curiosity and shock, I think. We watched it watch us for about 30 seconds, I think, before it hauled ass into the trees. It ran with a gait that I have never seen, and it was not human at all. It was about 9 feet tall, and its strides were long. As it ran with its head towards us, it just clobbered a small tree right at the edge of the tree line. As it did, the tree broke, and the Bigfoot barely flinched. This was when we both knew that it was not human at all. We didn't have the guts to check things out that night, but we did go back the next morning. But we couldn't tell much because it had rained that night. To this day, I swear by my story, and I'll swear that whatever that thing was, it was definitely not a human. Today's fourth encounter. I was towing my friend's car back to Midland, Texas. We were coming through Davis Mountain area of southwest Texas. The road was a 2-lane highway. I saw something on the side of the road that at first thought was a large cactus. I was driving about 35 miles an hour. I hit my high beams and slowed down. When I turned on my brights, I saw a very large head turn around. By then, we were passing this thing. It looked to be about 7 feet tall. As we went by, we all turned and looked at it. And it was looking at us as well. It had a very large head, large eyes, and very thick hair. The body was covered with thick, matted fur, hair, whatever. It stood with a stoop, and its arms were very long. This thing didn't move as we drove past, and there was a very strong smell of garbage. Today's fifth encounter. 3 of us were returning on a road trip late at night. I was number 2 in a line of 3. It was a cool night with a high level of light fog that was above our heads maybe 4 or 5 feet. It wasn't solid fog, but patchy just every now and then. The animal was on the side of the road crossing the ditch south to north and was about to cross my path. It stopped as I swerved to miss it, and as I looked behind me, the number 3 rider had to drive away around because it had stepped into the road. We stopped to verify with each other what we had just seen. Our stories were the same, and being late at night and very dark, we decided to get the hell out of there. In hindsight, we should have gone and looked for evidence of the animal. Today's 6th encounter. I arrived at a site during a fall thunderstorm, and after it passed around 9 p.m., set up to fish under the bridge as the water was running, and the catfish had swam upstream from Spence to feed. Observed one identifiable human foot track fresh in the river mud under the bridge and several large smears along the riverside in a 20-foot radius. Around 10 p.m., from across the river, we heard 2 loud roars that ended in a scream, grunt, cough. This was unnerving, as we had fished this area several times in the past, and even though at times felt nervous in the area, maybe spooked, nothing like this before. After the screams, we heard a heavy movement in the thick mesquite in the area the roams came from. Then heavy thudding sound. Nothing more occurred for about an hour until my fishing buddy said in a low voice that Someone had just thrown a rock at him. At that moment, a large rock hit the dirt between us with a very lot of velocity. I yelled out, "Cut it out!" and another roar answered me. This time there was no doubt it was time to leave. We gathered our gear as fast as possible and left for the truck, parked up on the road above us. As we were walking up the concrete to the bridge, we both heard very heavy splashing and something running in the river below. The river at this time was about 5 feet deep due to the runoff, and a grunting noise. When we got to the truck, we both saw river mud splattered all over the windshield, side, and grill, and the most foul odor I had ever smelled. It smelled like lake mud when the lake turns over in the fall. I've never been spooked like this before or since. Also, I never returned to that spot because it scared me so bad. Problem is, it's some great fishing. Locals in the area at times had told us to stay away from under the bridge, but never gave any explanation. The store in the town of Silver, population 10 at the time, was the area's meeting place. Today's 7th encounter. My uncle owned a small ranch, a couple hundred acres. He used to lease it for deer hunting. The year was 78 or 79, summertime. Each year after hunting season ended, we would return and fix or repair the deer blind, spread deer corn, and place salt blocks out to keep the deer in the general area for next year's hunt. We never stayed at the location for long, only a couple of days each month to check out the place. On this trip, we had only planned to stay overnight and return the next day. We arrived on Friday morning and began to check our deer blind, nothing unusual, making a few repair and dropping some deer corn, and several deer blinds around the property. The trailer we had on the property had no running water, so any bathroom duties had to be done outside. It was evening, maybe nighttime, and I was urinating outside when I noticed a rather large, strange-looking tree in the distance. It stood looking at what I thought was a tree, and I remember thinking, I had not seen a large tree there before. I took 1 or 2 steps to the side to see if I could get a better angle to see it. That's when it slowly crouched or kneeled down into the shadows, and I could no longer see it. I walked inside and told my uncle that I thought we had poachers or trespassers on the property. It's not unusual to see illegal crossing fences or property. I was only able to see the shape or silhouette, and this was from a distance. My uncle didn't seem concerned and told me not to worry about it. He said I have probably mistaken it for something else because it was so dark outside. The following morning, we were loading up the truck to return back to San Antonio. I told my uncle I wanted to collect some small cacti and bring them back home for my rock garden. I took a shortcut through the ranch to gather the small cacti that I had already staked out on a prior trip. I had collected 2 of the small cactus, and from some strange reason, not sure if I heard something or felt something, but I got up from a crouched position and turned to see a very tall, 7 or 8 feet, large, broad-shouldered thing. I focused on the shoulders immediately, then the elongated cone-shaped head. I saw no neck, ears, or mouth. It was dark in color. It appeared to be watching me from a very short distance. I was only able to see it from the breastbone or chest area up, due to the large bush in front of it. It slowly crouched or kneeled behind the bush, and I could no longer see it. I dropped the cacti and ran back to the ranch to alert my uncle. We went back to the location with weapons and found nothing except the cacti that I had dropped. I was telling my uncle what I had seen and now believed it was the same thing that I saw the night before. My uncle was trying to decide if we should stay or go back home when we noticed a car coming down the road. It was the local game warden. I remember asking my uncle, "What's the game warden doing here in the middle of summer?" What he replied was, "I don't know." The game warden knew my uncle because every year the game warden would come out to the ranch the first day of deer season to check all of our permits. The game warden said hello, then asked my uncle how long we had been here. My uncle told him that we had just arrived yesterday and were leaving just before he arrived. The game warden then asked if we had seen anything strange or weird while we were up in here. My uncle and I both looked at each other. My uncle told the game warden to talk to me. The game warden took my name and took me aside. I told him what I had seen. The game warden then took my uncle aside and talked to him for several minutes. The game warden got back into his car and left the ranch. My uncle began unpacking the truck, and I asked what he was doing. My uncle informed me that we were going to spend another night there. We spent another night against my wishes, and nothing else was sighted. We left the ranch the following morning, and my uncle instructed me not to talk about this to anyone. I agreed. It was the only time in my life that I had ever really felt terror. Today's 8th encounter. I was driving to San Anglo and had just come out of Cisco going towards Cross Pines on 206. When I looked to the right and idly glanced at the millionth field of cows I had passed that day. As I approached the field, the cows were all towards the back way from the highway, maybe 250 yards. I'm poor at judging distance. But I noticed something with the cows that wasn't a cow. It was black, like a few of the other cows, but standing upright on two legs, a bit crouched over one of the cows that was lying down. It looked a bit anthropomorphic, like a casual conversation between people. I drove past it thinking I'd just seen something odd, but not really sure of it. So I backed up to the shoulder to get a better look. When I did that, as I slowed to a stop, it seemed to look up at me. It stood up straight and walked toward the trees at the back of the field. It took a slow, loping gait as if to say, "I'm not scared of you, but I'm leaving anyway." When it had stood up completely and was trapezing toward the trees, I noticed the back of one of the standing cows it passed came up to about the waist of this creature, maybe a little lower. No one else seemed to be in the vicinity. I couldn't see what was behind the trees in the field, and no one passed me on the highway either when I was stopped or backing up. I didn't bother to get out and go look where it was standing because they weren't my cows or my field. As I stated previously, there were cows anywhere from 20 to 40. I didn't try to count them. About half were standing, half were lying down. The cows didn't seem to be afraid of it. They were minding their own business, grazing, lying in the sun, and doing normal cow things, with the exception of the black cow lying down at the feet of the creature. It was just staring up at the creature looming over it, neither one of them really moving. Today's 9th encounter. I was in the Air Force Security Police, or now Security Forces. I was also a member of the base SWAT team and involved in martial arts. I'd just gotten off duty but was asked to respond to a call about a baby crying in base dump. I only went with them because we had to discuss an upcoming base SWAT team training exercise. This was Bergstrom Air Force Base, now Austin Bergstrom International. I responded with 3 other guys. One was a black belt and a SWAT team leader, armed with a .38 caliber pistol. Another companion was a 3rd-degree black belt, armed with another .38 caliber pistol as well. The third was a canine handler with his dog. The dog was a holdover from those bred from duty in Vietnam. He was considered to be so dangerous that they had clipped and tattooed his ears to ensure no one accidentally handled this dog. The call came from the general's wife, so it had to be checked out. We went to the dump area. It was a very remote area of the base. There was a maze of deep creek and natural drainage in this area. The closest civilization was Bastrop, Texas, and a small prison. The dump was fenced on 3 sides by 6-foot fence with, I believe, a 12-inch Y outrigger on it. The 4th side of the dump was a 4-foot-high barbed wire fence. Beyond the fence was a freshly plowed field. The area was maybe 2 acres in size, in the shape of a triangle. We arrived and entered through a gate on one of the short sides of the triangle. To our right, there were several large trailer-sized dumpsters, and about 10 or 12 smaller Dipsy dumpsters to our left. The canine unit went first. As he approached the dumpster on the right, we heard the sound of a baby squeal. The cries seemed to move from one dumpster to another, moving further away from us. This was weird, but then the canine handler told us that he thought it was just a baby rabbit. He said he has heard them squeal like that before. After he got down to about the 5th dumpster, the sound came back towards us at the gate. We got a little creeped out by this, so the senior sergeant told us just to do a quick walkthrough so we could get the hell out of there. As we started back toward the vehicle, we heard the noise coming from the dumpster on our left, so we started checking them. When we finally got to the 7th or 8th dumpster, we heard what sounded like a very large-bodied impact against one of the dumpsters. Now these dumpsters were about 4.5 feet tall, and maybe 6 to 6 feet wide. There was about 10 or 12 feet spaced between them. When we heard the banging sound against the end dumpster, we let the dog handler order what we thought was maybe a person to come out. He gave them the order, and there was no response. He then long-leashed his dog and gave the order again. By now, the dog was pulling and tugging to get to where the sound was coming from. The winds were blowing away from us, so all we could smell was the stench of the dump. The dog handler gave its final command for the person to come out, or he was going to release the dog. There was no response. The dog was going nuts now to get to the sound. The handler pulled back the dog, unclipped it from the leash, and sent him toward the sound in attack mode. Just as he reached the end dumpster, preparing to run around it, this huge creature leaped from behind the dumpster, running. We all had our flashlights trained on the dumpster at about human height. This thing was huge, about 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in long, dark brownish fur. It didn't turn towards us, but ran out and across the field. It took 2 steps and stepped right over the barbed wire fence as it ran off. Our flashlight hit it in the shoulders. This was no man. The stride covered 10 to 12 feet in 2 steps, and then over the barbed wire fence without jumping. Most importantly, this killer canine was frightened so badly that he locked up on all fours and abandoned his full outright charge towards this creature and started screaming as if he had been hurt. He was looking up at the creature and started backing up, even as his momentum caused him to continue sliding forward. When he finally got his traction, he turned and ran past us back towards his kennel truck with his tail tucked between his legs. He was screaming in terror and was pissing himself, looking over his shoulder to ensure the creature was not following him. I would have doubted my own eyes, but this dog's behavior was one of pure terror. The dog was trained to attack on command without fear. I had never seen him behave in this manner, so I feared for my life. I knew he was responding to something real, so I was terrified as well. We were no more than 15 or 20 feet away. When this happened, the creature could be seen running across the field, disappearing into the woods. Since we had to report this in official government document, we delayed and discussed what we would put in the blotter until about 3 a.m. Had we told the desk sergeant what we saw, we thought we could have lost our security clearance, so we simply said it was a rabbit or something. I don't know if the report is public information now or not, but it will validate the response if nothing else. Today's 10th encounter. During August of summer of 77, I had gone fishing with 5 of my school buddies down at Lampass River. We got there during the early evening hours, about 5:30, so there would have been plenty of daylight for us to set out our trot lines. We used a rowboat to get up the river, where we would set our lines up against the river bank, about a quarter of a mile upstream from the overpass we had set our camp under. Once the lines were set up, we would take turns going to check for fish and rebait the hook. The first check came about 7:30. No fish were caught, and the hooks were rebaited. Second came about 8:30. Still no fish. The hooks were rebaited. At 9:30, it was time for myself and Glenn to go check the lines. Out of the 6 of us teenage fishermen, Glenn was the most level-headed one. He was a non-drinker, non-smoker Eagle Scout, and one of the funniest guys I had ever met. The rest of us were a bunch of hoodlums, and liked drinking and cutting up. So anyway, we set off to check the lines. We got to the bank where it dropped off a couple of feet and found the line. It had been marked with a red piece of cloth around the tree by it. I got a hold of the line and began pulling us down to the end as Glenn was rebaiting the hooks, which I pulled up. It took about 20 minutes to finish the baiting, and we started back down the river. Still no fish. About 50 feet from the end of our trot line, there ran a gravel bed along the river bottom from one bank to the other. When you get to this point, you have to pick the boat up and carry it about 50 feet until you get over it. Then set the boat back down, hop in, and take off. The depth of the water on the bed is only about 18 inches, and when you walk on it, would make very loud grinding sounds like rocks rubbing together. If you look around at the scene from this position, you see the river in front and behind you, but on both sides the river banks sloped up and are covered with trees. From the top of the slope to the water, it's probably about 30 to 40 feet with an incline about 15 degrees. So we get to the gravel bed, and I get out first since I was at the front of the boat. I step onto the bed and pull the boat forward so Glenn can step out. We pick the boat up and begin carrying it across. After 3 or 4 steps, we hear what sounds like very sharp cracking sound. We both stop and listen. Nothing but silence. We begin, and again we hear this loud cracking sound. Now we question each other as to what it was. Or could be. All of a sudden we hear what sounded like something rushing toward us from the west bank. We could hear what sounded like trees being broken, and we could see by the moonlight trees falling from the top of the bank, coming straight for us. We're frozen, and neither of us move. Whatever it is now coming right towards us. It gets through the trees and is completely exposed by the moonlight. The thing was coming at us very quickly. I fell backward and caught myself with the boat. This was all I needed to snap myself out of the trance. I held onto the boat and ran as hard and fast as I could over the gravel. Glenn was still holding onto the back and quickly hit the water. He too came out of his shock, and we worked together to get out of there. Fishing gear, bait, paddles, cushions, everything was flying out of the boat. We were screaming like a couple of 8-year-old girls. My foot found the drop-off of the gravel bed, and I jumped into the boat, grabbed one of the paddles I saw, and began paddling. Glenn's feet overlooked the drop-off, and he went over his head in water. He quickly surfaced and flew into the boat and grabbed the seat cushion and began paddling. We made it to the overpass, and all of the guys were yelling at us. They wanted to know what had happened. We jumped out of the boat and told them to get the hell out of here. Knowing we were very serious, we left everything, got in our trucks, and took off back to the cove. We ended up at Glenn's house for the night. Today's 11th encounter. I was heading to one of my deer blinds, and this blind is the most remote blind on a 3,000-acre lease. The land consists of a couple of open fields, but is mostly heavily wooded. The blind I was in always has a lot of activity around it. You will see deer, bobcat, armadillo, coyote, rabbit, all manner of bird, hog, lots of feral hog. The blind sets at the end of a road, at the end of the property, in somewhat of a valley. As you exit the wood, the road turns slightly to the right and drops down into the valley. From where the road exits the woods to my blind is at least 700 yards or more. The road continues down to the blind, but when I am hunting, I park my truck and walk to the blind, using a small flashlight so as not to disturb the wildlife. The land opens up from one end of the valley to the other. There was about 300 yards of fairly open ground from one tree line to the next. My blind sits on the northwest side at the tree line. As usual, there was a lot of wildlife activity until about 7 in the morning. All the animals, even the birds, just disappeared. Then I started hearing large branches breaking off and then something hitting the trees with what I assume branches. The blind set's about 12 feet off the ground, but I never saw anything. I used my scope and binoculars, but the woods are really thick. About 30 minutes after the branch breaking started, a hog ran out of the woods from the direction of the noise and ran into one of my guard wires on my stand. 3/8 cable. Very easy to see. It then jumped up, ran into the ladder, and proceeded over the hill. It seemed to be a bit frightened. About an hour later, a branch hit my blind. When that happened, I almost had to change my drawers. The branch breaking and tree pounding kept up for about 2.5 hours. When the noise stopped and the wildlife came back, I left. The next morning, I went back to the blind, walking, and as usual. About halfway, I could hear something walking with me. It was a little ways inside the brush. At that point, I reached into my hunting bag and got out my headlamp and put it on. I put my flashlight up so I could see my sidearm easier. I never wanted to run so bad in my life, but thought better of it. Just as I got to my stand, something very close to me made a very deep and guttural growl. That is the way I can only describe this sound, a deep and guttural growl. I dropped my hunting bag and went up the ladder into my stand in record time. About daybreak, the events from that day began again. I never smelled anything, nor did I find any tracks. To be honest, being alone, I didn't look very hard. I just recently told one of my hunting buddies, and to my surprise, he said, I knew there was something strange about that place. He said ever since he started going out, that he felt very uneasy, as if he was being watched, sometimes more than others. He has been hunting those woods all his life, so he's familiar with the surroundings. He told me there is one place he absolutely will not go on that property. If you knew him, you would realize how totally out of character this is for him. I didn't hunt the Lace in 2004 because of time constraints, but I think constantly about those 2 mornings in November of 2003. I didn't see what was making the noises, but I knew something was out there. Well, to me, those are some pretty terrifying encounters. When I narrate these encounters, I sometimes just put myself in the shoes of the person that is telling the story. And I really start thinking during the narration, like, holy shit, how did this guy get through this? Like, I would have took off running. I would have just ran right back to my truck. I would have done this. I would have done that. But I wasn't in these predicaments, so I don't know what I would do. I'd probably dump a deuce in my pants and run away like the little girl I am when I'm in the woods and scared of something. Just kidding. Yeah, but these are definitely terrifying. I mean, you got 11 encounters right there. And if you can honestly say none of them was scary to you, well, I'll shake your hand. Anyway, with that, guys, I want to bid you all farewell. Have a great night. And take care of yourself out there.